Hi, welcome to the Semantics lecturette introducing voice. Voice expresses a relationship between the valence of a verb and the semantic roles that its arguments play. And it's expressed by a wide variety of morphological means, some of which we'll talk about in this lecturette, and many of which we won't. And the valence, voice and valence go together pretty well, and we can characterize voices cross-linguistically in largely the same ways. Now, the one voice that every language has, as far as anyone can tell, is what's called the active voice. And the active simply refers to a case where the subject, or the agent, is performing the action. The grammatical subject is the agent of the action, or the doer, right? So, and we'll talk more about those roles later. So if you look at a sentence like Bellatrix read the stuff of thought, right? Bellatrix is the grammatical subject and the reader, and so that would be an active sentence, active voice. So in prescriptive grammar or in grammatical style or in writing style, people talk about active voice as something involving actual action or more dynamicity or whatever they want to call it. That's kind of a feeling. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. It's a confusion of the word active in the general sense with the scientific meaning of the word active in a grammatical sense. Active just means that. Same for the other well-known voice, the passive. Think of passive as receiving an action or letting things happen, right? Being passive and stuff. And people will confuse that meaning with the way that we will use it, which involves a sentence where the grammatical subject is the object of the action, or the undergoer, or the theme, or what have you, of the action. So in case, if Bellatrix read the stuff of thought is active, the stuff of thought was read by Bellatrix is the corresponding passive. English actually has two passives. Right? We have a passive that we can form with be, the book was read by Bellatrix, or John was run over by a street sweeper. Or we can use it with get. John got run over by a street sweeper. And there are interesting distinctions between them. They aren't exactly the same semantically. But in any case, the passive works pretty much the same way. It takes an active, and it takes one of the arguments away. So it reduces the valence by one. And then one of the questions that we'd want to ask going forward is the passive derived from the active? Now, another feature of the passive is that you can still express an agent. There can be an agent. But that agent is not an argument. It has to be introduced as an adjunct, usually by a prepositional phrase. Or in some languages, a special case, etc. Right? But it's not going to be an argument. Now, contrary to the passive, which applies to nominative accusative languages, is what's called the antipassive, which applies in ergative absolutive languages. And the antipassive also reduces the argument by one. But instead of getting rid of the agent, it gets rid of the object. And the agent becomes an intransitive subject, which in these languages is marked with an absolutive rather than the ergative case. As an example in the handout from the Chukchi language, you can kind of get a sense of how that works. So the same sentence, the young man carried away the load. In the first sentence, the young man, ergative, and they're the agent. In the second one, they're an absolutive, kind of a non-agentive subject. And the object is instrumental marked. It's oblique marked. Right? So just like with the passive, you can add it. You can add what you've taken away, but only as an adjunct. The antipassive. Now, there's also what's called the middle or mediopassive. And this is a very peculiar one. The middle voice or mediopassive voice. And it's peculiar because it has passive semantics, but active syntax. So English has some good examples of this. If you say, the stuff of thought reads easily, or these pants iron easily, or the book was not selling, that kind of thing. Where this dish eats like candy, right? The dish is not eating, it's being eaten, but the middle voice expresses it using the active morphology. Now in English it's limited to kind of habitual statements, and we also generally need some kind of adverb to help it out. So you say the book reads is weird, but the book reads easily is fine, right? And that's an interesting mystery. But a lot of languages have this kind of thing, and but they express it in different ways. So in some way, like for instance in Spanish, you'd use the reflexive. So bizarre, right? It gets weird. Now there's also another kind that's called the deponent. And deponent isn't really a voice, it's a characterization of active verbs that have passive morphology. And the term came out of the study of Latin and ancient Greek, which had these verbs. Most obvious example is the verb for speaking, loqui, which is in the passive. There's no active form for this verb. Right? And if I say I speak, you have to use loquor. Loquo would perhaps be the active, but that doesn't exist. You have to use the passive. But there's no passive meaning to it. And you can't make it passive because it's already in the passive morphology. So it's a mismatch between the semantics and the morphology. You could probably say that the middle is too. So they're very bizarre. But a lot of languages have these deponents. And there are other kinds of expressions as well. And we'll talk about some of these, as we get to them. But these are the most well-known ones and the most well-studied ones. All right, so there's one more thing I want to get to, and that's the reflexive. And I'm going to include it here in this voice. We don't call the reflexive a voice, really. These are voices. And these are not. But the reflexive interacts with voice in a very interesting way. So in English, the reflexive is pronominal. We don't even care. You just add a pronoun, it gets bound, whatever, yada, 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 yada. In a lot of languages, though, the reflexive is verbal. That is, it requires a morpheme that goes onto the verb that reduces the valence by 1 and indicates that the whatever object there is the same as the subject. But instead of having a grammatical object, there's just a reflexive. Good example, handouts from Choctaw. Turkish is another good example of this. Actually, Turkish is a great example of this sort of morphology because it has not only reflexive, but reciprocals, which are like reflexives, but involve reciprocity. This each other kind of reading, and we get that sort of thing. So to give example from Turkish, the verb tanish, tanish, the stem tanish, or actually that's already going too far. Tane, to know someone, right? And you can make that reciprocal, I think, tanish. So this would be to know one another. And so me and him know each other. That'd be tanish. Tanish. You can add a causative to it. Tanishtur. And so this would be to know someone, to know each other, to make people know each other. And then that can be put into the passive. And so this would be to introduce in English. So I introduced them, I made them know each other. And then we can add the passive, to that. So we get the reciprocal, the causative, and the passive all in the same verb stem, and then you get the inflection. So a lot of convoluted semantics or convoluted morphosyntax, and it might tell us something about the semantics. But Turkish is a very helpful case because it has this very agglutinative and transparent morphology. In English, we'd use different verbs. Right? So this is to know, or we'd use objects, to know each other, to introduce, to be introduced, and so forth. So there's different ways of expressing these very similar concepts, but they all fit together pretty well. Okay, so that's voice with a little bit of reflexive on top of it. And that's going to help introduce a lot of these concepts, and we'll be talking about them, going around back and forth, as we try to understand how these structures are built in the semantics and, of course, what they mean.